Perfect. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually, and my sincere apologies. The first day I had to make you wait. Some scheduling issues and technical issues, and generally we start before 5 minutes. Okay, so just please bear with me for today. Okay, good. So yes, Mr. Yash Agarwal, you haven't missed anything. In fact, the session is getting started now. My name is Kiran. Okay, I will be taking your international finance course for the next 8 to 10 sessions that we have. Okay, largely the way the course will be conducted is according to your study material, but I will also be incorporating a lot of practical aspects, a lot of hands-on kind of thing that we'll try to discuss. About me, I don't know. I mean, what do you want to know about me? I have this qualification. I'm a BCom, PGDBA, all these things. I'm an academician. Okay, I'm not an industry practitioner. I'm an academician, but I do have around 8 years of industry experience. I did have work with in the banking and wealth management industry for nearly 7 years. And for the last 8 years, I've been into academics, research, and consulting. So largely connected with the industry, but not employed with an industry. Okay, so currently I am a visiting faculty. I am a freelance corporate trainer across different educational institutions. I'm based out of Bangalore, and my areas of specializations are finance. Finance by my qualification, my experience, it's finance. Okay, but fintech and analytics is something that I am developing for the last 4 or 5 years, of course, to upgrade and upskill and reskill myself. And yeah, I do have some skills. So my contact details, I'm available on WhatsApp also in case of any personal discussions if any one of you want to have. Okay, that's a quick introduction about myself. I would welcome you to connect with me on the LinkedIn so that we all can stay connected. Okay, good. So that's my introduction. Anything else you want to ask me about myself, you're welcome. Meanwhile, it would really help me if all of you can put in the message, because I think this is the first time I'm taking any session for you. I would really like to know what is the background of the students that are in the classroom right now. So accordingly, it will help me to customize my delivery. So may I request you to put a message, about your, what you're doing, where you're working, and yeah, maybe a quick word about. Okay, hello finance. Hello. Kaushik says hello finance. That's a really nice thing. I want to like that. Okay, Disha, Pooja is working with Disha. What is it into? Gitanjali is working in stockbroking. Which firm? Gitanjali is in Motilal Oswal. Okay, okay. Mr. Praveen Bhai is a government officer, electrical engineer, retired. Mr. Kamlesh is in Kotak Securities, 12 years of working experience. Give me a high five. I also have lots to share with you on the stock markets. So Mr. Sarang Sapra is risk management domain, working with Western clients. Okay. Mr. Kaushik Jain Kochar is in CA office in Mumbai. Madhvi working as angel investor advisory. Okay, that's interesting. Sandeepan working in SBI. Yash is working in automobile industry in Ahmedabad, looking for an upgrade in capital markets. Excellent. Sandeepan has 5 years of experience. Excellent. Ram Singh is operational excellence manager. Sudeep is working with KZ International Limited, Malaysia. Okay. Graduate and working in export import industry, Mahalakshmi. Okay. Miss Gitanjali is planning to pursue CA. Okay. Priyanshi is a graduate and working with ICICI Bank. Madam, you and I have a lot of common things because I did work in HSBC Bank for almost 6 years of my life. Okay. So Divya Unikrishnan working in SAP Finance Consultant at PwC. Okay. Ruchi Mehta is working with Supreme Petrochem Limited. Okay. Interesting. Arindam Das, automotive designer in Mahindra. Purnima from 8 years in jewelry industry as inventory manager. Okay. At TBZ Limited. Okay. Recording is not on. I thought it's on. It is recording. It is recording. It's recording. Okay, good, nice. I'm sorry, I cannot definitely remember you by your name and company. Okay, it's probably it would have helped if you had met in a physical classroom. The experience would have been different. But yes, I kind of my purpose of asking is to understand where you come from and largely what might be your preferences. I have some way of understanding. Now, having said that, I would like to spend 1 minute, okay, at the cost of uh, one thing, that what do you expect from this course, okay, when you saw that you have a course called international finance. Okay, sorry about this. Just let me just close this. Okay, let me open a new file. Okay, so when you saw that there is a course called international finance which has been which you will be studying, what was your expectation from this course? If you could give me some expectations. Okay, I would like to just make a note of it quickly. Okay, learn and grow on a daily basis. Ms. Pooja, I guess that's that's true for any course that you study, isn't it? Okay, so especially in this course, international finance, what do you think is this course about? Completely agree with you, Ms. Pooja, but I'm more specific in my question here on the subject expectations. What are the things that you think you would be looking forward in this course? Now, I'll just write down. One is, somebody says exploring finance. Yes, we will. Okay, I'm going to write what you're telling me. Managing finance globally. Okay, I'll say global finance management. All right. Double taxation treaty. Okay, that's something. Okay. Financial modeling, I am not sure. I'm not sure. Do we have financial modeling here? Sarang says, I expect the course to teach us dynamics, interactions, and dependencies between financial economies at a global level. So something on the economics of global economics, for example. Okay, that makes sense. And yes, I'm going to tell you, whether we are going to reach that or not. Okay, and I don't hesitate in saying that no, we are not covering this. I'll be very blunt with you on that way. Understand impact of globalization. Okay, yes, globalization. Okay, makes sense. Modeling, yeah, the modeling part I'll come to. Okay, well, I would love to do that. Okay, but I'm not sure if it gets covered. Okay, international trade and finance practices. Okay, I would highlight on the trade practices. That's something that Yes, good. Chinmaya, you've written in capital letter, right? Which is actually yes. You're going to discuss a lot about forex. Yes. Global business expansion. Okay. Can I use the word MNC strategy? If you are a company, how do you expand yourself geographically, right? Trade practices and trade finance. How do you finance trade? Yeah. Financing beyond domestic boundaries. How can different firms grow their business at global level? MNC strategy. Okay. MNC, I would say growth strategy probably. Financing beyond domestic boundaries. Okay. Can I say rising capital in international market? Rising capital in international market. Correct. Okay. Somebody's saying international law. Okay. That's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure if we will be discussing that. Valuation of what, Ms. Divya? Valuation of a company, you mean? Divya, you might have to expand a little more on that. Structured finance at international level. Okay. Structured finance. Yeah, this itself needs an explanation for many of us here. So I understand what you're trying to tell me. Structured financial instruments. Yes, we do have one or two instruments. Paurnima is saying international parity relations. Okay, you seem to have gone through the course already. Okay, parity relations, yes. M&A again comes here, growth. Okay, you mean forex valuation. Okay. Okay, I'll say forex and valuation thereof. Okay, let's see. Okay, see, I think most of you are telling me the what you say, the curriculum expectation, the coverage that you think, if I can put them into, okay, this covers in first chapter, second chapter, etc. Yes, financial instruments, I would put it here, rising capital market. I will put it here, financial instruments. Okay. Yeah. So I think I'll just, delete the ones which I'm not expecting to be covering. Okay. But I'm not sure also. Probably if there is enough time towards the end, I do have a model. I do have a small case study through which I can cover financial modeling, but I'm not promising that. Okay. It depends on a lot of things. Structured finance, I think that is not getting covered in this course. Okay. We will be discussing some financial instruments. For example, we will discuss something called a currency swap. Now, if that is something that you are definitely going to learn about that, but if that is the structured financial instrument, okay. Otherwise, all other things they were definitely going to discuss. Okay. Law is something which we will not be covering in this course. That's another disclaimer I would like to put. Otherwise, all other aspects that you mentioned and much more will be definitely discussed in this. All right. Now, I also want to kind of give you a perspective on give you a perspective on say how this course has to be viewed. Okay, this is a problem compared to many other courses that I teach. Say, for example, if I'm teaching an accounting course, okay, it's very simple. What I believe in is whenever we do in a class, we need to, tomorrow you might be teaching or you might be a trainer or something. You need to, give a personality to the, student, right? So when I'm teaching accounting, I will tell the student that, what, you are an accountant. Now you need to record the transactions and do it. Or if I'm, let's say, teaching marketing, I don't teach marketing, but if I'm teaching marketing, I'll say, remember, imagine that you are a marketing manager. Okay. But my problem in international finance here is, I don't know what role should I give to the student to think himself. Okay. At some topics when we are discussing, I would want you to think like a CFO or a CEO of a MNC. Okay, which basically tells you what are the decision areas if you have to manage or take decisions in the area of your corporate finance. Okay, sometimes I will have to ask you to think like a forex trader. How do you buy and sell currencies? How do you make profits? In fact, we will see some ways to make profits in forex strategies. We'll see. Okay, as a forex trader, I will have to ask you to think. Sometimes I'll have to ask you to think like an economist. Okay, in fact, the first chapter you want to think like, what are we learning? We are learning economics here. Okay, so sometimes we will have to think like an economist. Okay, sometimes we'll have to think like some theorist. Okay, sometimes we'll think like theories. We are going to be discussing a lot of theories. Somebody said parity relations, right? We're going to be discussing parity theories. Okay, so that way we are going to take different roles. Okay, I'll try my level best to tell you what is the level of expert. Or probably once you go through the topic, you yourself know what role that we're going to take in. But be prepared. It's a very a broad course. Okay, so at every time we just have to know different things. Sometimes we are talking international economics, sometimes we're talking forex trading and dealing, sometimes we're talking theories, sometimes we are solving numerical problems. All right, all that will go on throughout this course. All right, so just keep that thing in mind. With that, let me start off my today's session. Okay, before I begin, are there any questions or any other thought processes that you have which you want me to discuss, or I will directly jump onto the topic. Largely the modules will be mapped with my sessions. Okay, so the structure of the session is exactly like your modules. Okay, in your study materials, I've mapped it. It will go in the same flow, but in between you will find that there is some modules which I'm taking more number of sessions. It's not one module, one session. All right, some lengthy modules I might take 2 sessions or even 3 sessions, and you're still covering one session. For maybe in one session I might cover 2-3 modules together. All right, so just be a little more prepared for that. Either you follow the structure of study material or follow the structure of my course. In both ways, you will end up learning everything. Okay, there will be a lot of additional slides that I would be putting which is not there in the study material. That also you need to be aware of. Don't be surprised, oh, this is not there in the textbook, and are you teaching something other than that? That is because I believe we need to also bring in the latest information. We need to bring in practical examples. So because of that, I will be doing that. All right. So now for the first session, we'll try to do this. We'll try to get ourselves accustomed with what is this international finance? Why is this important for us? Why are we studying this in the first case? Okay. So I'm sure all of you have studied financial management. Okay. Or you know the meaning of financial management. Like in an MBA, you have a marketing management, you have a HR management, you have financial management. Why do you need financial management? Naturally, company deals with money. There's finance, there are funds. Now you need somebody to manage it, because if you don't formally, in an organized way, don't manage your money, then your money is floating around all over. So whatever good business that you do will, if you don't manage your finances properly, the revenue gets leaked and your costs will go up and things will be haywire. So we are very clear why we need a financial management in a company. Now, this becomes a little more complex when you talk about an internationally present company. Okay, for example, it could be a company which is into exporting. It could be a company which is into importing. Okay, whichever way, this gets a little more complicated because of few factors. Okay, number one, a domestic financial company, let's say there is a company which is operating only in India. Okay, that need not worry about the exchange rate fluctuations. Correct? Whereas a company which is operating in more than one country, which we call it as MNCs, multinational companies, has to worry about exchange rates. Definitely worry about exchange rates. Correct? And the second thing is the risks. I would say risks. At a global scale or at a global perspective, there are some risks that you are exposed to when you're operating outside your country. Okay, see, any company, any business has risks, no doubt about that. All right, but there are some risks which are specific if you're operating outside your country. For example, a risk of a war breaking out between your own country and the country where you're operating. Okay, something like a political risk. Okay, or it could be a exchange rate risk itself, or the risk of interest rate, the borrowing of money elsewhere in another country. The interest rate might be high for you, or things like taxation issues, regulatory risk. Exactly. I was about to think about this Vodafone thing that happened, right? So now you're operating in another country, and that other country is just changing the rules to benefit their own. Correct? So end of the day, you have an attractive market there, but you need to be like submit yourself to that regulatory body in that country, which can change the rules whenever they want to. Right? So that is basically, of course, there are fixes to that, but having said that, that risk you're exposed to. Okay, so because of these two reasons, exchange rates and the risks that you're exposed to, the finance manager or a CFO of a international finance has to be a little more, how do I put it? Has to be a little more knowledgeable, skillful, and has to have an additional angle or additional dimension to his work than what he would do if it's a local company or a domestic company operating in only one country. All right, so in that context, international finance fits in. All right, now in this chapter, we'll discuss, overview of international finance. We'll also learn how the international monetary system has emerged, and we'll also talk about institutions in international finance. To start with, some slides I might keep skipping here and there because, I may feel that they are not really that important. So, okay. So we know any company's objective is maximizing shareholder wealth. Okay. I hope this concept is clear for all of us. Any company, anything that they do should result in, any decision that they take should result in maximizing the shareholders' wealth. Okay. Now, when you're, managing the company within the country or across the international border, this challenge becomes this objective becomes even more challenging to achieve, because one wrong decision can, erode the shareholders' wealth, right? So therefore, it is important that you learn the dimensions of international finance. Okay, which is what I was trying to explain to you. So how can a company get into, international zone? It could be based on bilateral trade or multilateral trade. So we know the meaning of that. Bilateral trade means when two countries or companies or entities in two different countries partner with each other, that becomes a bilateral trade. Multilateral is when more number of countries come together and, merger or transaction arrangement, that becomes a multilateral trade. Okay, so what are the different ways in which companies can do international business? Let's try to put them in a perspective. One is the international trade, okay, which could be summarized as export and import. Okay, I don't think we need an explanation for this. Now, the other way in which companies can go international or operate internationally are international contracts. Okay, what kind of contracts? Say a company can go with a licensing kind of an arrangement. Okay, or it can go with a franchising kind of an arrangement. Licensing is you pay for using a certain technology, you pay for using a certain a brand logo, okay, whatever it could be, of a foreign company. All right, or the other way of looking at it is you lend your technology, you lend your brand name or a logo to another company abroad. That is licensing. You're giving the license to use. Okay, whereas franchising is you're setting up a franchise, a distributor, another distributor in our country. Okay, so who will pay you for using? He's basically running your business on your behalf. Okay, that's a franchising arrangement. Then you have management contracts. Okay, wherein running the business of some other company. All right, you generally find it in hospitality business. You'll find it in hospitals, right, where you're taking your you're taking your expertise in running a business and offering it for a price. That's management contracts. And then you have the turnkey projects, like let's say we have that bullet train thing coming up, right? Or some foreign company comes to India and sets up a airport and leaves, right? So that's basically one project has a certain limited objective, achieve that objective and leave. Okay, these are called turnkey projects, right? So there are these four ways in which a company can go international. Other than that, how else can a company go international? Naturally through FPIs and FDIs. I hope you know the difference between FPI and FDI. So an FPI, foreign portfolio investment, also sometimes referred to as FIIs, foreign institutional investments, are basically you buying securities of another company abroad. Okay. Yeah, we have separate slides for each of them. So examples will also follow. Okay. I'm just giving a basic introduction here. Next slide, we'll talk about one by one. Okay. So then foreign direct investments is you go invest in the assets in that company, you run a business. Like, for example, a lot of these automobile manufacturers like Hyundai, for example, in India has done a FDI, correct? So Tata's have their plants in UK, for example. So they are called FDIs. A company goes abroad and buys a business and manufactures and sells. Okay, that's FDI. So let's spend a little more time on each of them. So you know the meaning of export and import. Okay, so there is a direct export and there is an indirect export. Okay, a direct export is when a foreigner directly sells the product in the local market. Okay, that means a foreign company comes to India and sells its products directly here. Okay, indirect is through some intermediaries itself. Okay, so that is direct and indirect. And then you have the contracts that I talked about. The first example is licensing. So foreigner transfers technology to a local, for technical service. Okay, so for example, you can think of, I don't know how many of you know about this company called Page Industries. Okay, Tesla. I mean, do you think Tesla? I think they will set up their business now here. If they were to, I mean, initially it will be an export, I'm assuming. Okay, and then I will assume they will, or are they going to give the technology to some company in India, Mr. Yash? Please turn your chat messages to everyone so that everyone can. It's a small group of students, anyways, so it's okay if messages keep popping in. So licensing, I think I would rather talk about the Page Industries. Okay, Page Industries, for example, is a company which has been licensed, the only licensed company in India to manufacture jockey products, the jockey innerwear products. That's the only company. Okay, so that's one of the examples that I can think of for licensing. All right, and then you have franchising, which is, like take your McDonald's, for example. Okay, that's a licensing, or any other brand generally you find. Okay, they are all franchisee businesses only. Okay. Again, this difference is not really clear cut. Okay. See, nobody is defining these things, by the way. We are trying to put, we academicians are trying to put it in perspective. End of the day, how do you explain Nike, for example? It may be licensing, it may be franchising. We don't know what exactly is the terms, right, that they're using in their agreement, right? So it's not that clear cut differences. They don't try to debate in yourself that, okay, is it licensing, or like, for example, Suzuki with Maruti. We really don't know. Yeah, exactly. Yash is mentioning that, right? Maruti Suzuki be license example, as they have given technology for production. But if you see Maruti Suzuki, yes, they have a licensing agreement. There is a payment that goes from Maruti for each car that has been sold. So that way franchising also comes. Plus it also comes under another arrangement called joint venture. Okay. So therefore, my point here is, do not try to have a very clear cut, definition for all of these things. Just understand you can follow any of these methods or a hybrid of these methods. You need to think, I have a business. Okay. I have a product. I have a business. Now I want to go international. So what are the different ways through which I can go? I can probably give a license to somebody who will use my technology and manufacture, and he sells at whatever price he wants to. Okay. Franchising is more standard, where I will, like, for example, McDonald's, everything is standardized there, right? Okay. I do not want the franchisee to do any other innovation than what I tell him. I will take care of the marketing. He just has to set up a shop and run the business, right? So all you have to think is, okay, I have a business and a product. I have these options for me. End of the day, at the contract drafting level, I can always go with modifications to this. So it's not really that clear cut differentiation. Management contracts is a foreigner runs local business on behalf of a local. Okay. Holiday Inn. Okay. And a lot of these hospitals nowadays, if you see, they're being managed by foreign healthcare companies. Okay. So they basically, what they do is, the property is of a local person, the business is of a local person, but they charge a fee. Okay. And they run the company. Okay. They take care of the management part of it. All right. So management contract is that. Turnkey project is, foreigner constructs a local facility and hands over the keys to a local to operate. Okay. Like, for example, bullet train that I mentioned, or it could be any other infrastructure project where a foreigner's technology is cheaper and more efficient, and let's say the government of India might call, or maybe a company can also call a foreign company to come and set up the plant and go. Okay. So especially in the government projects, we also see these kind of things, no? Cruise construction. We also would have heard of these things, no? Like build, operate, transfer kind of an arrangements, right? So that's also something which we can put under turnkey project, right? So foreign investment, as I told you, FIIs and FDIs. Okay. So FDIs are where, we'll just directly discuss the example. Foreign portfolio investments, there are, like, if you can see on the screen there are some examples I've taken from Economic Times. These are basically, let's say, for example, if you take Morgan Stanley Asia Private Limited, Singapore Private Limited, they are a investment company. Okay. Well, their job is to go to different countries and invest in the markets in those countries. Okay. So in India also, they are one of the leading investors in the markets. You would have heard a lot in the capital stock market things that FIIs have been net buyers, FIIs have been net sellers. So basically what they mean is, FIIs come buy the securities and leave. FDIs are, a foreigner actually sets up a business. He will compete with the local business. It's not just buying the securities, it is owning and controlling the firm. Okay. For example, Toyota, if you can think of Toyota Motors, what they do. Or recently we heard Benz has invested some $5,000 billion or something, sorry, 5,000 crores of rupees into some Chennai plant, right? So this is basically, they're setting up the plant here and manufacturing. We are talking about Apple setting up its manufacturing plant in India, right? Like what it was in Chennai. Yeah, Yash, what is this Tesla that you're trying to talk? I mean, if you can give me a little more explanation, that would help me. So Tesla is going to manufacture FDI example. Okay, okay. So they're going to set up a plant in India and manufacture cars, is it? Is that the proposal, or is it already on track? I'm not updated on that. If you can throw more light, it'll help. Okay, okay, okay. So, okay, that's an interesting news. They will manufacture in Bangalore. Okay. I don't know how I missed it. Oh, it has already started. Okay. Okay, good. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yes. Sorry. I got it. I know. I remember that. Yeah, I mean, okay, good. Okay, so we all kind of understand what is an FII, what is an FDI right now, right? Yeah, the trend of India's foreign direct investment, you can actually follow this website which I generally keep seeing, called tradingeconomics.com. I'll probably give the link for you. Just keep watching this whenever you need some information. Tradingeconomics.com. I just try to go there and try to see what is the situation of FDI. Okay, so I see that, like, for example, in fact, the link is part of the slides. Okay, in this slide what I'm showing, this image has a link. Okay, so most of the images which I'm putting on the source will be, the link would be given in the PPT itself. Okay, so you can see the FII trend, right? For the last 2 years, I'm seeing month on month they're giving. If you want, you can see year on year also. Okay, so just get an idea of the trend. Of course, because of COVID, there has been some fluctuations. It's not down, but it's fluctuating. Okay, so this is how the trend has been. In fact, 2020 it peaked. During the COVID period, in the middle of the COVID period, it peaked, and then it started falling. Okay. Yeah, so just keep a tab on what's happening with the FDI seen in the market. And there are two types of FDI. One is a greenfield investment, the other one is a brownfield investment. Okay, see, greenfield investment is, there is no, I mean, the foreign company is coming, let's say, into India, and they're starting afresh. Okay, so the whole plant is set up and they're doing the manufacture from the scratch. They're starting the FDI. Brownfield investment is when you get into a country, acquire an existing company, and then you start manufacturing or whatever, running the business. All right. So greenfield investment and brownfield investment. Greenfield is you're starting afresh. Okay, that means you're investing, buying a land, setting up your factory, and doing everything from the scratch. Brownfield is there is already a company, you just buy that company and start working on it. All right, so that's basically a greenfield investment and brownfield investment. Greenfield could be, how do you enter? You could set up a branch, you can set up a wholly owned subsidiary, you can set up a sister concern like a subsidiary, or you can also have a financial collaboration. All right, and you can also have a joint venture like what Maruti Suzuki has. Okay, all of this come under greenfield investment, as long as the business is starting. I mean, the factory is not present yet, you're starting from the scratch. That's a greenfield investment. Okay, a brownfield can be an M&A. Okay, but you're acquiring an existing business and you're going to run. That's the difference between greenfield and brownfield. Okay. So when will you choose for a greenfield and a brownfield? Of course, it's strategy. Yeah, I'll do that. Of course, it is a strategy. Okay, but when will you choose to go for greenfield and brownfield is how quickly you want to get into that business. Okay, so brownfield seems to be easier, but of course subject to opportunity available. Okay, see, greenfield investment is, say for example, Tesla wanted to, yeah, I'll repeat both of them. Let's say Tesla wanted to set up a manufacturing plant in India, right? So did they acquire a company, or did they bought the land or leased the land and started the whole process from the scratch? They lease the land, they set up the plant. Of course, there is no other manufacturing plant which is already doing the job, so that is a greenfield investment. Okay, whereas brownfield is you come into the country and there is a company which is already doing that job, you take over that business, you buy that business, you merge with them, and you run the business. Okay, somebody is already manufacturing, I'm just going to buy that company. Right now in my mind, I can, Walmart investing in Flipkart, for example. Walmart investing in Flipkart. Flipkart was already running. Okay, so Walmart simply bought over them, started, their presence in the country. So that I would put it as a, you got the difference now? Okay, now in the previous slide, when I told you this ways, so when in the greenfield also, like Tesla, for example, when they wanted to set up the plant here, what will be their ownership arrangement? Okay. Yes. Okay. Any foreign company merging, like for example, Tata Steel. Why you only talk about foreigners buying Indian companies? Talk about Indian companies buying foreign companies. Tata bought Chorus Steel, if you remember. Tata bought Chorus Steel, right? In fact, they bought the Chorus Steel. They bought that Land Rover. What is that company? Jaguar, right? What is the name of that company? Tata Motors subsidiaries. Just give it a second. About us subsidiaries. Yeah. So Jaguar Land Rover Automotive. Yeah, JVLR. Correct. JLRA. Okay, that's a car name, but JLR. Okay. Now this is a brownfield investment for Tata because already the manufacturing setup was there. Correct. They just went and took over that company. Correct. So this is a brownfield investment that I can think. Right? But if Tatas have gone there, set up the plant and started manufacturing their cars, then it would have been a greenfield investment. Okay, I hope that difference is clear. Okay. So yeah. So yeah, when Tata Motors went, to buy this company, they could have set it up as a branch which is doing this job. It could be a completely wholly owned subsidiary, which is 100% equity. Okay. Okay, or it could be a subsidiary. That means Tata Motors is there in India. Then you also set up Tata Motors UK, and Tata Motors India will own 50% to 100%. Or it could be a financial collaboration with Tata Motors India to Tata Motors UK. I'm just saying. Okay, or it could be a joint venture with a local firm there. Okay, that is what Maruti Suzuki has done. All right. So this is basically the brownfield. Naturally, country like India would welcome any investment. Right now, our target is to get as many. But compared to FIIs and FDIs, country like India would like more of FDIs and FIIs. Okay. Yeah, foreign investment in new facilities is greenfield. Foreign investments in new facilities is a brownfield. Okay, then what is a multinational? More than one country, you can simply call it as multinational companies. And the truest form of multinational company is a stateless actor. That means they will not belong to any particular country. Okay, of course, even it might take some days or some more years and decades to reach that stage. But even today, many companies, even though they are stateless actors, that means, for example, if I tell you Apple, okay, now Apple is a US company. For whatever, in our mind, it is still a US company, even though they are present across the world already. Okay, so they run the business equally in all the countries because we're still relating it to the original promoters hailing from a particular country. But over a period of time, this is what we're going to see, that we do not identify a company by where it is started. Okay, companies will start as an MNC. When they start itself, they start an MNC. Thanks to the advancement in the technology and internet, now today you don't need to set up a company in one country and then slowly geographically expand. You don't have to do it. You can go global from the word go. All right. So that's basically where we bring in the word stateless actors to call MNCs. That is, we don't really relate a company to one company. In fact, companies like Sony, okay, they're very consciously trying to build a model where they don't want to say they belong to a certain country. They're listed in multiple countries. Their stock is listed in multiple countries. They don't have that headquarter versus subsidiary kind of a model. They have everything is a headquarter for them. Okay, so many companies we will find that will start becoming stateless. In fact, the word itself is changing now. In fact, in your textbook also, if you go, they don't use the word multinational corporation. They use the word transnational corporation. Transnational corporation. This is the most correct word or the most buzzing buzzword that we are referring to when we refer to these companies, because they are present across multiple countries. All right. Yeah, so we will also continue to interchangeably use the word MNCs and TNCs. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to also give you this perspective. This is some image that I have taken from some article. This is world's top 100 economic revenue collectors in 2016. Okay, I'm trying to get such a chart for the recent years. I haven't got it, but it's okay. We will understand why. You will also know why I'm talking about this in a while. Just give me 1 second. See, the largest country which is generating the revenue in 2016 only is United States, which has like 3,363 US billion dollars. I mean, billion dollars of revenue. The second was China, which had a revenue of around $2,465. All of these are in billion dollars. Japan, Germany, France, then comes UK, then you have Italy, Brazil, Canada, and the 10th place was Walmart. Now, Walmart is not a country. It is a company. It is an MNC. Okay, maybe now it would have been taken over by probably Amazon. Okay, but let's say just to get a perspective on what is the size of these MNCs. You would have heard Apple's valuation is something like 3 times of India's GDP. That one mobile manufacturing company, the valuation of that company is 3 times of a world's third largest country, if I'm not wrong. Okay, third largest country's revenue. Okay, so that is GDP, right? Look at this. In fact, you can see Walmart is above most of the other countries. It is bigger than Sweden, Netherlands, of course, India, Indonesia, Finland. You compare with all these countries, Walmart is in 10th space. You have some company called State Grid Corporation in China, China National Petroleum, Sinopec Group, okay, again a Chinese company, Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company. Then comes Sweden here. Then you have ExxonMobil, Volkswagen, Toyota Motors, Apple, Belgium, BP. See, maybe the positions might have changed by now, definitely. But definitely one thing that we can definitely see is most of these companies, MNCs, are generating a revenue equivalent to countries or more than many countries. Okay, so this should give you a perspective why any company would like to go abroad. Okay, why Amazon wants to be present in every other country, why Facebook wants to be present in every other country, because this is the kind of scope that they get. When a company goes international, okay, the company becomes bigger. It becomes a mega company, right? So this should put a perspective. As long as you're operating in one country, there's a limit to what you can achieve. All right, when you go global, you can go on going global, right? So I mean, look at Google, look at all these Apple, all these companies, look at their growth, right? Look at their growth rate, not stopping only that, the growth rates are in double digit, triple digits continuously. All right, there is no that product life cycle reaching that maturity stage. We're not even seeing that yet. Okay, there's a constant innovation that's happening. There's a constant, every area of business they're getting into, right? So that's how MNCs have to be viewed. All right, so a lot of advantages. One, of course, you would have discussed about something called economies of scale, economies of scope, right? When you operate at a larger scale, your costs get, your fixed cost, for example, gets spread across multiple product units. Your advantages of reaching out to maximum number of customers, your purchasing power, okay, because you're a bigger company, your bargaining power over suppliers will increase, correct? You can influence, I've not mentioned that in the slide here, but you can influence the regulators, correct? Do you agree with that? When you become such a big MNC, you can actually influence the regulators, which is what most of the companies are doing, right? So that's another advantage you have. You can share your technological and managerial know-how, your R&D. R&D output could be used in multiple. So what it does is it gives you that scale to invest in R&D. Okay, so you can take advantage of low price factors of production. Okay. When you're a country which is present in multiple countries, okay, so a lot of advantages are there once you become an MNC. Okay, so yeah, this I think I'll skip this. Okay, it's not part of your syllabus, so I don't want to confuse you with that. So why a company should go for international business? Why a company should go for international business? So one of the theory says that what is called as comparative advantage theory. Okay, so what does comparative advantage theory says? We all understand this. Okay, look at this example. What we have here. Okay, what we have here. Okay, let's say for example there are two countries. It's not a real number. Just for the sake of example, I'm putting here China and India. We have two commodities. Okay, it's an economic theory. It's an economic theory. Wheat and potatoes. Okay, now China can produce. Rather China can produce whatever capacity that they have. Let's say whatever factors of production, they can produce 100 units of wheat, or they can produce 200 units of potatoes. And India can produce 80 units of wheat and 100 units of potatoes. Now we need to see who has a comparative advantage in which product. Okay, for example, China. Now you need to think like this. To manufacture 1 unit of wheat, what they're foregoing is 2 units of potatoes. That means the cost of producing 1 unit of wheat as measured by potatoes is 2 potatoes. That means using the factors of production to manufacture 1 wheat, same concept in India. Manufacturing 1 wheat, if they manufacture potatoes, they could manufacture 1.25 potatoes. So naturally, the cost of producing wheat in China is higher compared to India. Okay. Similarly, if I see the potatoes, the cost of producing 1 potato in China is 0.5 wheat. You're foregoing 0.5 wheat. Okay, whereas cost of manufacturing 1 potato in India is 0.8 units of wheat. So manufacturing wheat is costlier in India. Manufacturing wheat is costlier in India. So going by this, what makes sense? Okay, I think I would any day manufacture, let's say, wheat in India and potato in China. That makes more sense. Okay. I will manufacture in China. I will manufacture potato. All right. I mean, ideally, it should be manufactured that way. And India should manufacture wheat. This is the best combination because the overall production will get maximized here. Okay. So China can produce 200 potatoes and India can produce 80 wheats. Okay. Which is overall you would have used least amount of resources or factors of production. So therefore, we say that China has a comparative advantage in manufacturing potato. India has a comparative advantage in manufacturing wheat. Okay, so they can manufacture and they both can exchange the products. All right. So basically, the idea is whatever capacity you have, overall, what is the demand for wheat? We need a total of 180 wheat. No, 180 wheat is required. 180 is required, and potatoes we need 300, right? So what India can do is India can manufacture 180 wheat, okay, whereas China can produce how much potatoes? We need 300. China can produce 300 potatoes, okay. So that 300 potatoes can serve both the markets. All right. This is one economic explanation why companies have to go international. Why countries should encourage companies to go abroad. All this FDI, FII, why we need to allow that is because of one reason is comparative advantage theory. The other reason is the imperfect market theory. Okay, that is the factors of production which create comparative advantage are immobile. Okay, say for example, there is a let's say for example there is a China, for example. One of the reasons for the China's success rate, in hosting a lot of MNCs in their country is the abundant availability of land. Correct. Now that land cannot be moved. No, the land cannot be moved. So that means the companies have to go there. All right. So that's basically one of the theory why companies move to countries like Japan, for example. The availability of land space. Okay, Japan, Germany, they have the technology. But they don't have enough space and also enough labor. It's not available in those countries. So therefore, they have to go out of their country to manufacture. So this is another reason why companies go global, why the international business keeps growing. The third reason why companies go international is the product life cycle theory. Okay, so for example, you start a business, okay, in a country, product becomes successful, it goes through that introductory life cycle stage, then it grows, it becomes big. What next? Think of Facebook. What happened? They started Facebook in a one city, actually not even one country. Then it grew, and as the business was growing, they spread themselves in one country. Once they reach the maturity stage in that country, what is the next stage of growth? Okay, if you don't do anything for growing further, you will decline. So what Facebook did is they started expanding themselves into other countries, correct? With the technology and the internet growth and the smartphone adoption and all that, now it is much easier to grow internationally, isn't it? So any company that you set up, what is the underlying reason why a company can go could be summarized by these theories. Comparative advantage theory, because you have a better advantage in manufacturing one good, which could be exchanged by another country's ability to manufacture another good which you need in a much better and a cost efficient way. Imperfect markets theory, because you don't have some resources which you don't have, so you need the resource, so you go to that country to manufacture. Product life cycle theory tells you if you have to export yourself, you need to go global. Okay, how do you grow as a company? We talked about MNC strategy, growth strategy. That how do you grow as a company? If you have to grow as a company, one, you have to introduce new products, or you need to acquire new markets, isn't it? So the new market, once you have covered the local market, is the only way is international, correct? So these are few theoretical backgrounds why companies go international. Okay, and why we need IFM, I think I've been telling you. Okay, why we need international finance, why we have to, because there are a lot of if I were to normally talk about financial management, I will not talk about, let's say, the legal aspects of it, cultural aspects of it, different tax environments. We don't talk about it in normal domestic financial management. When it comes to international finance, we'll have to touch upon all these aspects. Okay, at some point of time in this course, I'm also going to talk about how the capital budgeting, what we do normally, project appraisal, will also get affected because of things like withholding tax, for example. Okay, things like the repatriation restrictions put by the host country, right? So all these aspects have to be kept in mind. Political risk analysis, how do you account for it? All these things have to be looked for. Okay, when you go international. So therefore, an IFM kind of a discipline would be required. Okay, so a lot of other factors, I'm again skipping that because, okay, now this is where I would like your attention here. See, the valuation of a company, how we do, how you do a valuation of a company. Okay, so a valuation of a company, if those who have studied finance would remember, is done like this. You need to probably estimate the cash flows. Assume that you have next 5 years business. Let's say, for example, you are expecting some 100 million in rupee terms. Okay, in rupee terms, I'm talking about a domestic company. Okay, domestic company. So I'm expecting 100 million rupees next 5 years, and at the end of the 5 years, the project gets closed. Assume that. Okay, and I know what is my cost of capital. That is, at what rate I'm borrowing the money to start this company. I know, say for example, it's around 10%. Okay, where am I borrowing this money from? I'm borrowing this money from an Indian, bank or Indian financial institution. So when this is given, what you do is, I'm sure you would have studied a time value of money somewhere. So what you do is you discount these values. You discount these values. Take the present value of these cash flows on this day, which is year 0. Year 0. This is year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, right? You discount all of these to year 0 and then take the sum of this. This is the value of the company. This is how we calculate. This is a normal financial, this is a normal model for valuing the company. Now, when it comes to an MNC, one more complication will come, which is this 100 million is occurring at the end of first year, but this is occurring in foreign currency, not in rupees. So this is in dollars, assuming your foreign company is in US. Okay, or if it is in some other country, that other country's currency. Now, you cannot simply discount it like this, because you also need to convert these into rupees. $100 to be converted to rupees. At what rate will you convert? So that means you need an exchange rate for next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You got it? Now, this is where my problem comes. How do I estimate the exchange? What do you think? What do I think that will the exchange rate be? Okay. So the valuation of a company depends on the exchange rate. That means my valuation model will change like this. Generally, your valuation model is like this. Sum of, expected cash flows divided by 1 plus R stands for WACC. Okay, this is how you calculate it. All right, this is how you calculate the value. But if it's a foreign company, you need to multiply this with one more concept called exchange rate. Okay, and also you should be able to predict it. Okay, this is the problem and the importance of learning international finance. Okay, so keep this now. Right. Moving further. When we study this course, there are 3 aspects to it. Okay, 3 aspects to it. One is the international financial environment. We'll try to learn. Okay, and then we'll discuss a lot about financial markets, which includes your forex markets, your derivatives market. Everything comes here, and we'll also learn about some corporate finance aspects. Okay, whatever financial management discussion that you would have learned. For example, you would have learned about, let's say, capital budgeting, correct, in financial management. Now, when it comes to an international, capital project, how do you do the capital budgeting? Okay, so for example, you would have learned about, working capital management. Okay, in a normal. So when it comes to international company, how do you do the working capital management? Right. So these are the 3 angles in which we'll learn. So one by one, we'll go ahead. We'll start with international financial environment. So which starts with understanding the international monetary system. All right. So what is international monetary system? Basically, how the whole world is connected. Correct. How the financial system of the world is connected. Like all the central banks are connected, and there is an IMF, which is the central bank for all the central banks. Okay. What is the background? How did it set up? How is the exchange rate is being controlled? Who is controlling exchange rate? Who's fixing the exchange rate? So we need to get a perspective on this, right? So that's what we're going to be studying in the next few slides. So before that, I would like to pause here for a minute. Let you ask me if you have any questions so far. It was a generic discussion. What I did was a generic discussion. I purposefully skipped few of the aspects. So generally, if you have any questions, you can ask me now. After that, I will take you forward with the monetary system, international monetary system. Any thoughts, any questions? Okay, first 1 or 2 chapters are a little theoretical. Okay, so you might have to, if you're not a theory person, you'll have to bear with me for some time. All right, cool. So let me proceed now. So add wherever possible. If you think you have some points to add, so please feel free to add. So how does the exchange rate calculation for NPV computation take place? Yeah, I mean, you want me to discuss that now, or when we go to that, capital budgeting chapter, should we do it? We'll do that there. There are 2 approaches for that. You have it's ideal. I have a example. We take an example and we'll do it. So, but just to answer your question quickly, there are 2 approaches. One, you can multiply each cash flow with the exchange rate forecasted, or you can calculate the NPV using foreign currency and you can multiply with the exchange rate today. Okay, so there are 2 approaches. It's called home country approach, host country approach. When I come there, I'll explain to you. Okay. So I think what you see here is the scene of the GDP of all the countries presented in a graphical way. So naturally, just get an idea of what country is in what position, which I'm sure most of us are aware of. Yeah. So there are 40 countries which we can call as the bigger countries, and totally 195 countries are part of this system. Okay, the number of countries are more than that. Like we have like more than 210 countries, if I'm not wrong. But most of them are small islands and all that. Okay, so what is international monetary system? Okay, see, for example, what is the India's monetary system? Who controls it? RBI controls it, right? RBI prints notes. RBI controls the money supply in the country, right? So that is basically India's monetary system. Is there a system in the international space where international, arena, that is there one system or one, organization which controls all these things? Okay, how does the transaction get settled between two entities in two different countries, because they both are having two different controlling systems? All right, what is this system? Okay, that system is called international monetary system. So originally it was pure barter system. Okay, then the disadvantages of barter systems, right? You don't have a measure. Okay, you cannot store the value. There is an arbitrary pricing that would happen. How many kgs of wheat for how many cows, for example, right? So, and then we have the metal bars which have been introduced. Okay, and then the government started issuing the currencies. All right, and also it depends on what kind of government is there, what kind of a constitutional policy principle that they run with. So there are so many things, right? So we'll try to put all of them under one perspective. So initially it was gold standards. I'm leaving the barter system now. So once we are more civilized and when we have a formal system, no, IFRS is a different thing. No, IFRS is for okay, sorry, I think all of you are not able to see the questions. So Ms. Divya is asking, so is international monetary system based on IFRS? Okay, now IFRS, for those who may not know, is a accounting standards, international accounting standards. No, madam, Divya, to answer your question, no, this is an economic discussion we are having. It's not based on IFRS. Okay, IFRS, when we come to accounting related aspects, I'll tell you. So we are learning how the exchange, okay, to put it simple, okay, what we're learning now is how does the exchange rate get determined? I think that's where we are going ahead. How we're going to understand how the exchange rate gets determined, how the money flow happens between countries. Okay. So for that, we are trying to understand how the money as a concept has been emerged. So initially it was gold specie standard. Okay. Like gold specie, gold bullion standard, gold exchange standard, wherein like gold specie standard is basically the governments were printing full-bodied coins with the that kind of impression on the gold coin, and this was allowed to be traded in that particular region or a kingdom or whatever you call it. And then the gold bullion standard was there, which was basically currency, even though it was not gold, but it was coming from the government. So basically this is where the token value and the token value of the currency versus the intrinsic value of the currency concept came in now. That is, if you see, for example, this one, okay, this particular currency that you're seeing, maybe this is a 1 gram gold, okay, 1 gram gold. Let's say the 1 gram gold was costing, let's say 10, I don't know, 10 paisa. I'm just saying, okay, I'm just saying 10 paisa. Okay. But on that, it is mentioned that it is 1 rupee. This is mentioned that it is a 1 rupee coin or whatever. So that means even though the gold value was not 1 rupee, the value of that gold, okay, if that seal was not there, it is worth only 10 paisa. Because the seal is there, it is 1 rupee value. Okay, this is called token value. All our currencies that we have today, for example, a 500 note rupee, sorry, yeah, a 500 note rupee that you, rupee note that you have, 500 rupee note you have, currency note. If that RBI signature or if it's not an RBI printed note, the paper does not have any value, right? So that is basically token value. Okay, because it is mentioned as 500 and signed by the RBI governor on your currency note, it is token value. Otherwise, it's the intrinsic value of the asset is not there. But these times, what you see here, the annas, we used to call it as annas, and there were like cents, right? So basically, the gold worth that much was being traded. Okay, so that is the concept of intrinsic value and token value. So there has been a improvisation. So at some point of time, gold got pegged against the USD. So I will talk about that in when we talk about what is called as Bretton Woods Agreement, one of the important things. I'll go there in a while. Okay, just note gold, and even not just gold, there were also other metals. Okay, like in countries like India, we were having copper coins also, right? So there are some advantages with gold standard, something called BOP adjustment, balance of payment adjustment. It would automatically move to equilibrium, okay, because of the gold price value going up, because the gold standard had the intrinsic value. Gold standard had intrinsic value. Okay, so if there was a gold value, irrespective of the the printed value of that, the gold had its own value, right? So this created, this gave an adjustment, benefit called BOP adjustment, and also it had a lot of price stability. Okay, because at any point of time, there would be demand for such an asset. Even without the, okay, there will be a player who would want to buy or sell this one, irrespective of that being a currency. All right, but today, if let's say for example, demonetization happened, right? Then what happened? All the currencies, that 500 rupee, 1000 rupee note which got banned, they became worthless immediately, isn't it? They became worthless. Correct. Now imagine they were like the gold currencies. Okay, even though the government says this is not a currency that we would accept for transactions, it still was an asset in your hands. Correct. It still had some value as gold itself. Right, so that way, these were the few advantages you had olden days when we had gold standard. But now we have moved to a better system, I'll tell you, which is started from Bretton Woods Agreement, which happened in 1944. One of the most important event in the human evolution. We must all definitely know about this. What happened, I will tell you. There was 1914, 1915 World War I period, 1920, 25 up to that. Then 1930 Great Depression happened, and then 35 to 1944 there was this World War II happened. So there was a huge chaos in the whole world. Okay, nothing was under control. Every country was behaving in its own way. There were colonization, like British were occupying India and China, correct? So there was a lot of this unstructured way of the world was moving. And it seemed that that was not the right way, because by that time industrial revolution had also happened. So the countries have realized that we need other countries. Other countries have to be looked at as customers, be it for the weapons that they have invented during the World War period, or the industrial revolution which brought in all this automobiles. So then the whole world wanted, whole world was a market. So why are we killing our own markets? Correct. So that is when all the countries have come together, including the countries which were fighting. In fact, if you see World War II, which were the countries which were involved? US, Japan, Russia, correct? So all these countries were actually part of the manufacturing process. They had all this, they had adopted and proven the mass production concept. So they needed markets. They needed more and more markets to sell their products. All right. So therefore, they all decided that we should not fight. There should not be any war to happen. That's when all the world leaders came together in this place called Bretton Woods, and they signed an agreement, which is where they formulated what is called as UN. Correct? UN. And also that is when they also stabilized the international monetary system through what is called as IMF. Correct? So we're going to discuss about this. So what is Bretton Woods Conference? Okay. Countries agreed to set up what is called as International Monetary Fund, IMF, International Monetary Fund, which will act as a central authority to control the money supply in the entire, world. Okay. So in 1945, IMF pegged all currencies to USD, which was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. So one of the first thing that they did was this. Okay. One second. One of the first thing that they did is this. Okay, so let's say, for example, there were two countries. Okay, country one, country 2. Let's say there were 4 countries, country 3, country 4. Now, any country could be trading with any other country. Now, what should be the exchange rate? Let's say this country had USD, this country had, I don't know, INR maybe, this country had something else, RBL, this country had something like pounds or whatever it is, okay, Dashmark, whatever. So different countries had different currencies. Now the problem is how many USD is equal to how many INR? How many INR is equal to how many DM? How many DM is equal to how many RBL? So I need a standard rate, right? Because otherwise what happens, even economically thinking also, if the exchange rate between these two countries and these two countries is not in a certain ratio, then it will create an opportunity for somebody who wants to trade. For example, let's say the rate was cheaper between USD and RBL and rate was costlier between INR and USD. So when INR wanted to, somebody in India wanted to buy something from US, you know, they might have found an opportunity here where they could have bought from RBL. I mean, they basically, instead of buying directly from US, they could have bought from Russia and Russian would have bought from US. Okay. So therefore, if you don't have a stability, and a standard ratio to compute the exchange rate, this would create a lot of this arbitrage opportunity. Because of that, what IMF did was this, basically, all of you tell us what is your gold reserve. You have to disclose your gold reserve, because gold was largely accepted, asset. So every country was supposed to disclose how much gold they had at that point of time, exactly on that day, how much gold you had. Say, for example, this company had 100 ounces of gold, let's say ounce. Okay. India had, let's say, 10 ounces of gold. Okay. Let's say Russia had 50 ounces of gold. Let's say DM had 25 ounces of gold. Fine. All the countries have disclosed their gold reserve. Okay. Now you convert your gold into dollars. Okay. So each dollar was pegged, each ounce of gold, okay, was given a standard rate that it is $35 per ounce of gold. Okay. That means you now tell me in dollar terms how much you have. So US said that I have around $3,500, okay, worth of gold. India said I have around 350 worth of gold. I have 50 into 35, which is around $1,750 worth of gold, and I'm guessing this is half of this, 875 worth of gold. Okay, now you set your exchange rate. You can come with whichever currency that you want, whatever is your currency. Okay, let's say, for example, India came out with INR, right? So what is the ratio of dollars to INR? It is 10:1. Whatever currency you come out with India, it should be 10 rupees per dollar. Here it is 2:1. Whatever currency Russia comes out with, it should be 2 rubles per dollar. Okay, this has to be 4:1. 4 Dashmark to $1. So that means what happened? Now the denominator became common in all cases. Because denominator became common in all cases, okay, and this was based on the gold reserve. Okay, so now they started looking at this. Now, what is the exchange rate between Indian rupees and dollars? It was 10 rupees per dollar. This is how the exchange rate was fixed. Now, what is Indian rupee to, let's say, ruble? Okay, they would say $350, $1,750. So which comes to how much? 1,750 divided by 350. You calculate this. Okay, so something like 4.5 or something. So they will say rupees 4.5 per ruble. Right? This way, every country could set up an exchange rate with every other country. I hope you followed this, right? So and this became a norm now. So every country, all it has to do is, it has to, if the country has to become rich, there are only 2 ways to do it. One, you can explore more gold in your own country. Okay, you mine more gold, you get more gold, that means you have more dollars worth of assets. So then you are growing as a country. Or you could manufacture goods and services and export to another country and get currencies from other country. Okay, end of the day, there is a limited amount of gold in the whole world. limited amount of gold in the whole world. Now you kind of, exchange. So whenever we say India is becoming, let's say, is India's GDP is growing, or we are earning more, our forex reserve is growing, that means we have taken from some other country. Some other country must have lost it. Okay, so it's actually a zero-sum game. In economic theory, it's a zero-sum game. There is a limited wealth. It only keeps moving between countries. Okay, so this is what Bretton Woods Agreement has done, and this whole system would be controlled by the IMF, regulated by the IMF, International Monetary Fund. Okay, IMF pegged all currencies to USD, which was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Okay, so this was effectively a gold exchange standard, because end of the day you are exchanging gold. It's just that I'm allowing you to print your own currency. Okay, so 1% plus or minus exchange rate fluctuation was allowed. Okay, but it will be controlled by the central banks. So IMF will have a control on the central banks of all these countries. Divya, what controls the price of gold? Okay, price of gold then and now gets controlled by, it does not control, it is led by the market, the demand and supply for it. Okay, because it is a scarce resource, because it's available in limited number, so the price keeps on increasing. Okay, like for example, what's happening with bitcoins nowadays? It is said that there is only maximum of some 21 million bitcoins, right? Somebody can mine. So already they have mined some 18-19 million bitcoins. So there's only limited. So once all the bitcoins are mined, there's a limited number of bitcoins. So people go on trading for it. So whenever there is any asset which is in scarce, limited resource, the price will only keep going up, provided that has a requirement in the market. Okay, yeah. So for example, oil also is in limited, availability, but at some point of time when oil is no more needed by the world, when we have other renewable energies, then the demand for the price of that will start falling down. But when there is a need for a product and it is available in limited, quantity, the price keeps going. Ideally, the price should keep going. So nobody controls price of the gold. The price of the gold is market driven. If a country wishes to convert its gold reserves to invest in industries or infrastructure, would the exchange rate go down? Yes. Yeah, you're right. So I'm assuming you're talking about gold reserve. See, right now, whatever money that we have printed, okay, say for example, whatever money that the RBI has printed, an equivalent amount of reserve has been made with IMF. Okay, either in the form of gold, and now they're also allowing forex. I mean, now the things have changed. Here I'm talking about 44. Now a country can deposit gold, it can deposit any foreign currency, or even something like SDR, special drawing rights. It could be deposited with IMF. Equivalent amount could be developed. Now, if I were to rephrase your question, if I need money, for example, if Indian government needs some, foreign currency, for example, sorry, not foreign currency, money. So we need to print more notes, for example. If you have to do that, we can withdraw our gold reserve with the IMF, and we can print more notes, is what you're saying, which will not work that way. No. Yeah, you cannot convert your gold reserve into investment. Sorry. Yeah, that's not a right way to look at it. Exchange rate will not get affected because that's not possible in the first place. What you can do is you can borrow based on your gold reserves. You can borrow from IMF fund, then you can invest in your country. Then see, exchange rate will not go down. Exchange rate will not go down. In fact, exchange rate will go up, because see, again, going by this logic, at any point of time, I am one country. Okay, let's say I am country A. Okay, country A. I have, let's say, 100. I don't know in dollar terms to talk about. I have $100 of notes printed because I have deposited $100 worth of gold reserve with IMF to start with. Okay. Now, let's say I do some export. So more dollars will come in. So I will add another $10 through exports. So my total reserves are $110. That means I become richer by $10. Let's say I do more imports. When I do imports, what happens? My dollars goes out. When they go out, for example, let's say $20, I'll become poorer. So when I do more imports, when my dollar reserves go out, my gold reserves go, I mean, my gold reserves will come down. That's what it means, right? So the asset has moved from one country to another country when you do more imports. That's why, you know, you will always find countries doing export promotion and import discouragement. Okay, so that's basically what it is. So countries could devalue with IMF approval in case of fundamental disequilibrium. See, don't think that this is the system currently prevailing. This is how we started. In 1944, this is how it started. Okay, so by 1973, if I'm not wrong, 71, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Okay, so countries have, you know, lost track of it. Countries started deviating. So in fact, the then President Nixon, he kind of came out, and it was a big news that they announced that there is no more Bretton Woods system. Okay, in fact, between 1971 and 73, there was another system which I'm not putting in the screen here, called Smithsonian system. Okay, and another agreement that they had, Smithsonian agreement that they came out with, but that also did not survive. Countries wanted to have, because by then there was a lot of growth that happened in the economic theories, and it was realized that we should let the exchange rate be, you know, determined by the market. Okay, because in the current system, it was US which had the upper hand, correct? So because every gold was pegged against the dollar, so that's where the system got collapsed, and you know, they came out with the floating rate system. So in fact, not just floating rate system, any countries could follow whatever system that they want to follow. Okay, so majority of the countries adopted the floating rate system. I mean, within that you have multiple systems. I'll talk about that in few more slides, what kind of systems that you can have. But generally it was set to the market. That is, the demand for a currency was not led by the gold. Instead, it was the exchange rate was fixed by the market forces. Okay, now here is a difference. Okay, here is a difference. You are still printing your notes. The printing of the notes is still based on your reserve with IMF. Your printing of note is still based on the reserve with IMF, whereas your exchange rate determination is driven by market. Earlier system, printing notes, exchange rate determination, both were controlled by IMF. You need to get this difference. Earlier, how many notes you can print, how many currencies you can print was determined by IMF based on the gold reserve. Exchange rate also was fixed by that US dollar 35 per ounce of gold. Correct? This was given by exchange. Now that is removed now. Okay. So today IMF still controls the money supply in the world, but the exchange rate is left to the market. Okay. So what is the advantage of floating rate? It brings in the automatic equilibrium. I mean, like any demand and supply theory you would have studied in economics, right? It brings in the automatic equilibrium. When we know that exchange rate gets influenced by inflation rate, interest rate. These are the two major factors which drive exchange rate. Okay, so exchange rate brings a kind of an equilibrium in the inflation rate. If inflation rate is going too high, exchange rates adjust itself, because the demand for your product will come down. If demand for your product comes down, the exchange rate falls down. Correct? And vice versa. Correct? So inflation rate will come under control with the, with this kind of a system. It also brings in the kind of insulation that is required. It prevents any exogenous shocks. For example, USD peg that we talked about, $35 per, that was highly dependent on USD. What if something goes completely wrong with US market? Correct? The whole world was dependent on US markets. Correct? So, or maybe the other way of looking at it is, let's say US market at that time, I'm saying, something very bad happened in US and the whole, the country's economy tumbled, but still the USD will still carry the higher value. So that means you're pegging against a currency which is not strong. Okay. So of course, overall, the countries will do well. The trade flows and the capital flows will increase. Okay. Because countries can negotiate the price. No. Okay, money supply would be unconstrained. Okay, countries can print notes. If I want more notes, I can borrow from another country. See, which was not possible earlier system, isn't it? If I want to, if I want to print more notes, what I can do? I can borrow from other country. I can deposit the foreign currency and I can print the notes. So the money supply could be modified, which is what happening today also, right? Whenever the economy goes down or there's a cash crunch, what do our governments do? They will announce FDI norms, right? FDI reforms 1.0, reforms 2.0. Why do they do that? Because more foreign currency can come in and that will give us more money supply, correct? No painful readjustment when gaps between peg and market forces become unsustainable. Okay, so basically over a period of time, that's what has happened. Today, nobody remembers that peg system at all, correct? Today the system is so well framed. There is no individual person who can influence the exchange rate. Okay, it's only purely the trade transactions and the capital flows are the ones who will determine the exchange rates in the world. Okay, so what are the different exchange rate choices? We'll discuss this and we'll close the session for today. So today any country can follow any of these systems. Okay, I have a very funny way of explaining this. Okay, I tell you how you should think role play. I don't know how many of you know there is a Swamiji, in South India, Bangalore, close to Bangalore. His name is Nityananda. Okay, he actually took over an island and he said that he's going to set up a country. Correct? Funny it may sound, okay, but it's actually true. It's actually true. So basically, he took an island and called it a country of his own. It's not recognized by UN or something. Okay, it's not recognized. It's just for a on a lighter mode to understand this concept. Now imagine that you are in that country's economist. Okay. Now you need to decide what should be your exchange rate. Correct. So I don't know what is a country name. Something starts with Sri. Some country name. Okay. So you need to come out with the currency for that. You need to come out with the exchange rate system for it. So how do you convert? What kind of system can you adopt? Now you can go through each one of them and I'm going to explain one by one how we can think of these as a concept. Say, for example, you can follow a float system. For your country, what you can do is you will have a central bank, but you leave the exchange rate to be fixed, determined by the market. Okay. So, for example, you may come out with your own currency X. Okay. Let's say your currency is X. Currency X is your currency. Now you can let the market determine the price, supply and demand. Okay. That is completely free float. Majority of the countries today we have free float or what is called as managed float, as known as dirty float. Okay, that is, it is left to the market, but the government can intervene if there is any overlying deviation that is happening. Okay, so in fact India follows this system, managed flow system. Okay, wherein it is left to the market, exchange rate gets determined by the market, but there is a government intervention wherever required. Government can step in and they can even devalue the currency if required. Okay, so for your country, Kailasam, yeah, I remember Kailasam is the country. Okay, so Kailasam, you can use a free float exchange or a managed float exchange. Okay, the other kind of interventions are basically within the managed float. Like I said, government can intervene. Government can do what is called as stabilizing. That means the exchange rate is left to the market, but buying and selling the foreign currency, the government can do that buying and selling of the foreign currency to control the rate. Okay, if the government sees that the exchange rate is boating up, they can do some selling of the foreign currency, selling of the domestic currency to bring down the foreign exchange rate. They can do that. And then sterilization, non-sterilization actually. Okay, so where the government will purchase the foreign currency by creating new currency, new local, print more rupees and purchase more foreign currency. Thereby you squeeze the liquidity of the foreign currency in your market. So that is non-sterilization step. Then sterilized intervention could be securities, purchasing securities. Okay, in foreign securities. In foreign currency. Okay, so this is another way of controlling, and then several central banks can come together to come out with an agreement to stabilize the currency. So you can coordinate with three other central banks can come together and control. But see, end of the day, you need to realize exchange rates are under complete control of central bank. Complete control of central bank. So central banks can do any of these things and control the exchange rate. They can do that. Indian central bank can do that. Of course, the market will react negatively if they go overboard. They are aware of that, but they can definitely come under control. That's how India has been doing, right? India, for example, if you take last 10 years, the inflation rate has been largely under control, correct? You might know the concept. For any country, inflation rate should not be too high. It should not be too less also. Correct. So RBI wants to keep it at that 4 to 5% range, and it's been successfully doing that for the at least last 10 years. I've been observing, except in between 2012-13 it went up to 13% because of because of oil price hike. But otherwise also, despite all that, the country has been able to central bank has been able to control. How they are able to do it? One of the method is exchange rate. Okay, so the sterilized and the non-sterilized way of controlling exchange rate. Okay, what is your objective? Let's say dollar price to US dollar 75 rupees to $1. That's the price, right? Now let's say suddenly the price is increasing to 80 rupees, 85 rupees. For some reason it is increasing. Okay, now you want to bring it under control. So one thing that you can do is you can for example, sell more dollars. That means the government of India, out of their forex reserve, can sell more dollars. When you start selling more dollars, what happens? The dollar price comes down. And vice versa. Vice versa is also possible. You got it? So that is non-sterilized. So non-sterilized means just buying and selling the currency itself. Okay. Sterilized is issuing a security. For example, the government can issue a foreign currency bond, for example. They can issue a foreign currency bond, okay, and make people invest dollars into that particular bond. Let's say government of India, okay, Indian government is not known for doing this, okay, but UK government, for example, we always keep seeing, they issue foreign currency bonds, okay, where the investors in that country, especially the banks, can invest those dollars and buy those bonds of the government. So those, I mean, when I say dollars, I'm assuming it's a foreign currency. So when the foreign currency is squeezed from the market and it is in the hands of central bank, okay, that is sterilized way of controlling the exchange rate market. All right. Okay, just give me 1 or 2 more minutes. Okay, let me finish this section. I want to finish. Then the next system is currency peg. Okay, now this is the easiest for Kailash Island, Nityananda's country. Single currency peg. That is, a currency is pegged to the currency of a major trading partner. For example, every country has trading partners, right? So for example, India, one of our major trading partner is China. Okay, let's say, for example, that new country that they form, their major trading partner will be India. Why? Because most of the people who will visit that country would be from India. So they can peg their currency. Peg means, say that whatever X currency, which is their currency, equals X1 per rupee 1. So I'll peg it with rupee. Simple. However rupee goes up or down, my currency will also go up or down. That is single currency peg. Or I can also peg it to a basket of currencies. I can create a basket of currency. For example, I can create a currency basket with USD, INR, and Japanese yen. So based on some logic, I will create this basket, and this basket of currency will become an index for me. The movement of this index will determine how much is mine. So let's say X currency, one X currency is per index. So based on the collective movement of this, my currency will also move. Okay, that is currency basket peg. And then you have SDR peg. Okay, SDR, we will talk about it in a later stage. It's called special drawing rights. Okay, special drawing rights, which is basically, again, another basket. Okay, this is another basket. You just discussed basket. No, this is another basket created by IMF. created by IMF. So, which I think includes 4 currencies, which is US dollar. Okay, let me check that out. US dollar, Japanese yen, UK pound. 1 second. SDR currencies. Yeah, it has Chinese yuan. Okay, US dollar, euro, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, and pound sterling. So these 5 currencies are together formulated as one, SDR. Okay, so one of each is one, currency, that is special drawing rights. So you can peg your currency against a SDR. Okay, that is also allowed. All right, and then crawling peg. Now, crawling peg is a very rare system that you would find, wherein you're actually maintaining a fixed rate, exchange rate. The exchange rate is fixed, but eventually the government will modify it. Things like, for example, every month, at the end of the month, the government will make some change to the exchange rate. For example, what happens with the petrol price in India? I mean, may not be now, but previously, if you remember the petrol, diesel prices, how are they being fixed? It will be fixed for some period. It will be like 70 rupees per liter, 70 rupees per liter. For let's say, for example, Jan to March, it will be the period. In the month of March, they will again rise the price. They were rising the price, no? Rising the price on what basis? Then they will consider crude oil prices have increased, so therefore I'm increasing this. So then they will make it 75 rupees per liter. Then we know all those drama that would happen whenever the price will increase, right? That is crawling peg. Special drawing rights. Arindam, we will discuss special drawing rights in detail at a later stage. Okay, we are going to discuss special drawing rights given by IMF. Okay, so you got it, no? Crawling peg. Crawling peg is, it's a fixed rate. At every break of, let's say 1 month, 3 month, 1 year, once the exchange rate will get changed. The government will decide the rate. Okay, that is crawling peg. Then you also have something called currency board system. In this, so far it was central bank which was doing all these things. Imagine there is no central bank. Okay, but the currency is directly linked to the forex reserve. Okay, so you formulate something called a currency board. Okay, that currency board is independent board that will determine the price. Okay, so this is basically currency peg system. Okay, then you can also have a trade zone. I'm sorry, I'm going to take 2 more minutes if I may, with your permission. A trade zone is there is only one example I can give you: euro. So multiple countries come together and formulate a common currency for themselves. So the concept of euro, all right? Then currency substitution, wherein you can directly adopt some other country's currency. Okay, for example, Ecuador or Zimbabwe, they don't have their own currency. They have adopted the currency of USD. Okay, so in fact, Venezuela, you can type for this. Okay, you can type for this case. Venezuela, actually, there is a concept called dollarization that they're doing. Okay, that means the citizens have started using dollars. The government is still, having their own currency, but the citizens have decided to use dollars. They're all using dollars. So there is a slow dollarization that is happening. Okay, just type for dollarization in Venezuela. You'll find a lot of this interesting. So what citizens are doing is they're making their own money worth, less than toilet paper, right? So because it's a adoption of another currency, that's called currency substitution. So our, that's all. So our country, whatever Nityananda's country, he can follow any of these methods. He can adopt any of these methods. Just to get a better, perspective on these things, I have a Wikipedia link you can follow. I'm not sure if I pasted here. Yeah, there's a link I'm giving here. Please spend some time in this page. Okay, I'll also give you in the chat message. Yeah. See here, if you see, you can go through each one of them. Okay. See, these are the countries, okay, where US dollar is the legal tender. Okay, that means these countries do not have a legal tender of their own, currency substitution, right? So, for example, if you say this country, British Virgin Islands, for them, there is no currency of their own. US dollar itself is their currency. Let's say, for example, these countries, Monaco, they use euro as their currency. Okay, and then currency board. Okay, they have currency board. Which country? Let's say, for example, Dominica. They have a currency board. okay, where they use US dollar as the anchor. Okay, the currency board will follow the US dollar price and accordingly fix it. Okay, so then you have stabilized arrangement. Remember stabilized arrangement? So here these countries, Iraq, for example, has a stabilized arrangement. Okay, wherein the government will keep US dollar as the anchor. They will keep buying and selling US dollar to adjust the exchange rate of their own country. Crawling peg system. Okay, very few countries. Botswana, for example, has a crawling peg system. Then you have pegged exchange rate. Tonga is the country which follows pegged exchange rate. Float. All these countries, most of the countries are following floating system. Free float is here. Yeah. So India, as you know, as I told you, is following floating rate system, but within that it has some other kind of a system. So just do visit this site, spend some time. Okay. Try to understand. Once we come back next class, we will discuss the next segment of this chapter. All right. So I'm sorry I took 5 minutes extra, but hope it was fine with you. I know you have another session starting shortly. So please carry on. You're welcome to put your questions in the portal. I'll be happy to answer. See you all next week or next to next week, whenever we have the next session. All right. All okay? Okay. Good. So can we close the session now? Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice weekend. See you soon.